Unsolved.
JonBenet Ramsey case. John Ramsey and the Coverup. Christmas night, 1996, John Ramsey has gravely injured JonBenet sometime before midnight. Now, what is he going to do? John decides to dump JonBenet's body in the park. He places her body in the back of his vehicle. He starts his engine, and he opens the garage door. But Patsy hears the noise below, runs downstairs, and catches John driving out of the garage. Patsy finds JonBenet in the car and says to John, "What did you do to JonBenet?" Then Patsy calls the police. The police arrest JonBenet Ramsey. Christmas night, 1996, John Ramsey has gravely injured JonBenet sometime before midnight. Now, what is he going to do? John strangles her to death with his bare hands. He puts her dead body inside a big Samsonite suitcase. He writes a very short and realistic ransom note. John leaves the note on JonBenet's bed. The next morning, Patsy finds JonBenet missing. Much later, because she made the coffee and doesn't find the ransom note, she yells for John. Patsy goes to the telephone to call her friends. John says, "Don't call them. Look, there's a ransom note here." She says, "Oh, sweet Jesus, I'm calling the police." He says, "Don't call them." They argue about calling. Patsy says, "Why?" "You killed JonBenet, didn't you? You monster." The police arrest JonBenet Ramsey. John Ramsey has gravely injured JonBenet sometime before midnight. Now, what is he going to do? John strangles her to death. He wraps her dead body inside a blanket, places her body in the wine cellar to dispose of in the morning. He writes a longer ransom note explaining that they will kill JonBenet if they call the authorities. And John places the note on the spiral staircase this time. The next morning, Patsy finds the note on the stairs. She examines it closely and realizes that John wrote it. She yells, "You monster, you killed JonBenet," and Patsy calls the police. The police arrest JonBenet Ramsey. John Ramsey has gravely injured JonBenet sometime before midnight. Now, what is he going to do? John makes a garrote and strangles her with it, like some foreign faction killed her. He wraps her dead body inside a blanket and places it in the wine cellar. John writes a long ransom note. This time he disguises his handwriting by using computer-printed letters, explains that they will kill JonBenet if they call the authorities, and Mr. Ramsey needs to get the money from the bank before the phone call. The next morning, Patsy finds the note, yells for John. She goes to call 911. John is dumbfounded. Why won't she read the note? John considers killing Patsy, but he doesn't have another large suitcase. Patsy says, "What should we do?" He responds frustratingly, "Call the police." The police arrive, but don't find JonBenet. John is dumbfounded again. The police ask for a sample of his and Patsy's handwriting. John refuses to give him a sample of his writing. The police demand that he give him a sample, and he gets angry and starts fighting with the police. The police arrest JonBenet Ramsey. John Ramsey has gravely injured JonBenet. Now, what is he going to do? John makes a garrote using Patsy's broken paintbrush. He strangles JonBenet to death. He leaves the garrote hanging around her neck. So when the authorities find her dead, they will think a foreign faction has killed her. He wraps her in a blanket and puts her in the wine cellar. John writes a long ransom note from Patsy's notepad. He addresses it to himself. He disguises his handwriting the best that he can. He explains that the ransomers will kill JonBenet if they call the authorities, and Mr. Ramsey needs to get the money from the bank before the phone call the next day. The next morning, Patsy finds the ransom note on the stairs, carries the note to JonBenet's room, then yells for John. Patsy reads some of the note this time and tells John the ransom amount of $118,000. Then she says, "What should we do?" John says, "Let's pay the ransom. It's not that much. Plus, the bank will have that many 20s and 100s there." Patsy says, "Let me call Barbara Fernie and Priscilla White first." John says we shouldn't do that. John calls Rod Westmoreland to arrange to get the money. Then he heads down to the basement, but he cannot get JonBenet's body into the suitcase. He places her body in the window well and heads upstairs with the suitcase. John moves his vehicle outside of the garage by the window well. He opens the grating and places her body in the car. John drives behind the Access Graphics offices and dumps JonBenet's body in the alley. He goes to the bank and obtains the money. When John returns, Patsy has called her mother, all her friends, and the police. The police question John and they find out what happened. The police arrest JonBenet Ramsey. Now, what is John Ramsey going to do? John Ramsey makes a garrote and strangles JonBenet with it. He leaves the garrote wrapped around her neck. He wraps her body in a white blanket and places it in the wine cellar. And he turns the wooden block to lock it. John writes a much longer ransom from Patsy's notebook. He starts the note with "Listen carefully," so Patsy will read it. John disguises his handwriting. He explains in the note that they will kill his daughter if they call the authorities, and Mr. Ramsey needs to get the money from the bank before the phone call. The next morning, Patsy finds the note and yells for John. Patsy says, "What should we do?" He responds, "Call the police." This time, Patsy calls her friends too. Police arrive but don't find JonBenet. And this time, Fleet White arrives, looks for her, and doesn't find her either. John cannot believe it. Now, what is he going to do? There's not going to be a ransom call today. The police ask for samples of his and Patsy's handwriting, and John gives them Patsy's and his notepads. The police say there's nothing in your notebook. John scribbles a few words down on a piece of paper for them, and they go away. 2 hours goes by. Then John remembers breaking the basement window during the summer. He goes down to the basement window and moves the Samsonite suitcase underneath the window. He puts a scuff mark on the wall and heads back upstairs. Another 2 hours goes by. Then Detective Linda Arndt tells him to search the house from top to bottom, looking for anything out of place. John immediately goes to the basement to show Fleet the broken window. Then he discovers JonBenet's dead body in the wine cellar, and John Ramsey gets away with the murder scot-free.
Nancy Drew Channel.
Well, this ends another episode of Unsolved. And please leave a comment to tell me if you think this last scenario is possible, and if it explains why the note was left on the spiral staircase, why John didn't dispose of JonBenet's body in the middle of the night, and why the ransom note is so long and states all the things that it does. And I'll see you tomorrow night for the Zodiac Killer case. See ya.